They called it the Juggernaut, not affectionately, at first, to the young American pilots of the 8th Air Force, trading their nimble, graceful Spitfires for this new machine in the raw spring of 1943. It was a bitter joke. 7 tons of metal, built around the biggest engine they had ever seen, with a fuselage shaped less like a Raptor and more like a milk bottle. In the mess halls and briefing rooms of East Anglia, amidst the smell of stale coffee and damp wool, they gave it other names. The flying milk bottle, mostly. Some, with a darker humour, called it the 7-ton coffin. They looked at its thick, stubby wings, its massive radial engine, and saw a machine built for anything but the delicate, violent ballet of aerial combat. It was, they believed, a symbol of everything the Americans did not understand about this war, a product of industrial brute force, not tactical finesse. A heavy, lumbering beast destined to be torn apart by the wolves of the Luftwaffe. The Germans, when they first saw it, agreed. On the 15th of April 1943, high over the Belgian coast, Captain Werner Schroer of Jagdgeschwader 26 squinted through his canopy at the approaching formation. He keyed his radio, his voice a mixture of confusion and amusement. "The Americans are flying barrels," he reported. The sentiment rippled through the Luftwaffe. These things were twice the weight of a Spitfire, heavier still than the formidable Focke-Wulf 190. In the casinos and headquarters of the Reich's fighter arm, officers like Adolf Galland initially dismissed the intelligence reports with a confident smirk. This P-47 Thunderbolt, as it was officially known, was too heavy to climb, too clumsy to dogfight. It was a bomber masquerading as a fighter, a testament to a nation of shopkeepers who understood assembly lines but not the lethal art of the sky. The laughter in their mess halls was genuine. It was the laughter of veterans, of aces who had hunted over Poland, France, and Britain, confident in their machines and their mastery. They had defined the rules of this war, and this new American challenger seemed to have read a different rulebook entirely. They were right. It had. What neither the skeptical American pilots nor the confident German aces could yet comprehend was that the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was not merely a new aircraft. It was a new philosophy of aerial warfare. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial logic that would, in less than 2 years, systematically dismantle the Luftwaffe and grind the German war machine to a halt. The story of the Thunderbolt is not just the story of a plane. It is the story of how mockery turned to terror, how an object of ridicule became a symbol of overwhelming, inexorable power. It is the story of how the laughter died, replaced by a frantic, desperate scan of the skies for the glint of a silver behemoth, and a sound that would become the anthem of Germany's destruction. The genesis of the Thunderbolt lay not in the skies over Europe, but in the anxious minds of American war planners in 1940. As the Wehrmacht stormed across France, the United States Army Air Corps watched with growing alarm. Their own fighter stable, dominated by aircraft like the P-40 Warhawk, was clearly outmatched by the Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds, and soon the Focke-Wulf W 190 seconds that were sweeping the skies clean. The P-40, though rugged, was a design already approaching obsolescence, its performance falling off dramatically above 15,000 feet. The sleek, cannon-armed P-39 Airacobra was an even greater disappointment, its engine lacking an effective supercharger, rendering it useless in the high-altitude battles that defined the European air war. A request went out for a new high-altitude interceptor, something that could meet the Luftwaffe on its own terms in the thin, cold air above 20,000 feet. The task fell to Republic Aviation and its chief designer, a Georgian émigré named Alexander Kartveli. Kartveli was a man obsessed not with elegance, but with power and survival. His design philosophy was forged in a different crucible than that of his European counterparts. While designers like Willy Messerschmitt pursued lightness and agility, creating fighters that were like fencers' foils, Kartveli envisioned a broadsword. He started not with an airframe but with an engine, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It was an 18-cylinder, air-cooled radial monster, the most powerful aviation engine in the world at the time, capable of producing over 2,000 horsepower. But power at sea level was one thing, maintaining it in the stratosphere was another. This was the critical challenge. Most aircraft engines used a supercharger geared directly to the engine, which worked well at lower altitudes but lost efficiency dramatically as the air thinned. Kartveli made a revolutionary decision. He would build his fighter around a complex General Electric turbo supercharger. This device, typically used in heavy bombers like the B-17, used the engine's hot exhaust gases to spin a turbine at incredible speeds, which in turn drove a compressor. This compressor would force dense, oxygen-rich air into the engine, allowing it to breathe and generate maximum power at altitudes where other fighters were gasping. The turbo was a brilliant solution, but it created an engineering nightmare. The unit was bulky and had to be placed in the rear of the fuselage for balance. This required an immense and intricate network of ductwork to carry hot, incandescent exhaust from the engine at the front back to the turbine, and then carry the compressed air forward again through an intercooler to the carburetor. This labyrinth of pipes, more than 25 feet of it, dictated the P-47's unique shape. The deep, barrel-chested fuselage wasn't an aesthetic choice. It was a necessary container for the aircraft's powerful lungs. Everything else was built around this core concept. To house the massive engine and its turbo system, the plane had to be huge. At an empty weight of nearly 10,000 pounds, it dwarfed its contemporaries. Into this massive airframe, Kartveli packed a level of firepower and protection that was simply unprecedented for a single-engine fighter. He armed it with 8 .50-caliber M2 Browning machine guns, 4 in each wing, carrying a total of 3,400 rounds. These were not the lighter rifle-caliber guns common on many fighters, nor the slow-firing cannons favored by the Germans and British. They were heavy, reliable, and destructive, capable of firing a combined total of over 100 rounds per second. The pilot sat in a heavily armored cockpit, a veritable bathtub of steel plate, and the big radial engine itself acted as a massive shield from the front. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, designed to swell and close around bullet holes. This was not a delicate instrument of war. This was an anvil, built to endure. The prototype, the XP-47B, first flew on the 6th of May, 1941, and its performance was staggering. It achieved a level speed of 412 miles per hour, faster than any fighter then in service. The Air Corps, stunned and delighted, rushed it into production. By late 1942, the first production models began rolling off the assembly lines in Farmingdale, New York, and Evansville, Indiana. The industrial might of America, now fully awakened, began to churn them out. Eventually, 15,683 Thunderbolts would be built, more than any other American fighter model in history. But as the first P-47 seconds arrived in England in early 1943, this impressive pedigree meant little to the pilots who had to fly them. The men of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups were the first to receive the new aircraft. The 4th Group was a particularly tough audience. It was composed of the former Eagle Squadron's American volunteers who had been flying and fighting with the Royal Air Force for years. They were veterans, accustomed to the nimble, responsive handling of the Supermarine Spitfire. To them, transitioning to the P-47 was an insult. They joked that if attacked, a pilot could simply unstrap himself and run around for cover inside the cavernous fuselage. Don Blakesley, a hard-charging ace and commander in the 4th, openly despised it. The initial workups did little to build confidence. Engines failed, landing gear collapsed, electrical fires broke out in the cockpit. Much of this was due to hasty assembly in England, but it solidified the pilot's perception of the plane as an unreliable brute. They had zero confidence in the machine they were being asked to take into combat against the most skilled and experienced fighter pilots in the world. The combat debut of the P-47 Thunderbolt was not merely inauspicious, it was a borderline disaster. The first mission, a fighter sweep over France on the 10th of March 1943, was aborted due to malfunctioning American radios that couldn't communicate with the British ground controllers. The planes were grounded and hastily refitted with British radio sets. When missions resumed in April, the atmosphere in the ready rooms of the 4th, 56th, and 78th Fighter Groups was thick with tension. The pilots, many of them Eagle Squadron veterans, still carried the muscle memory of the Spitfire. They were accustomed to a fighter that turned on a sixpence, that climbed like a homesick angel, that felt like an extension of their own bodies. The P-47 felt like driving a truck. It was sluggish at low altitudes, its controls were heavy, and its initial climb rate was poor. A Luftwaffe pilot, Kurt Bulligan, later recalled their initial encounters. The P-47 was very heavy, too heavy for some maneuvers. We would see it coming from behind and pull up fast, and the P-47 couldn't follow, and we came around and got on its tail. This was precisely the weakness the Germans exploited. The Fullview 190, in particular, was a master of the vertical fight at medium altitudes. The German pilots, the Experten, would lure the heavy American fighters into a turning dogfight or a steep climb, where the Thunderbolt's weight and mediocre climb performance made it a vulnerable target. For weeks, the P-47 seconds flew sweeps over the French coast, often being ignored by the Luftwaffe, which only added to the pilots' frustration. When combat did occur, the results were often frustrating. On April 15, the 4th Fighter Group finally scored the Thunderbolt's first aerial victory when Major Don Blakesley shot down an FW-190. Yet even this success was tainted. Blakesley, a fierce critic of the plane, was later quoted as saying, "It ought to be able to dive. It certainly can't climb." This quote, sharp and dismissive, perfectly captured the sentiment of the early Thunderbolt pilots. The plane had one good trick. It could dive like a falling anvil. In every other respect, it seemed a liability. 2 weeks after Blakesley's victory, the 56th Fighter Group lost 2 Thunderbolts in a bounce by Focke-Wulfs, without scoring a single victory in return. The 8th Air Force High Command was facing a crisis. Their strategic bombing campaign, the cornerstone of American strategy in Europe, was predicated on daylight precision bombing. But the bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, were proving tragically vulnerable to the relentless attacks of the Luftwaffe. They needed a long-range escort fighter, and the P-47, with its poor climb rate and initial lack of drop tanks, could barely penetrate enemy airspace before its fuel gauges forced it to turn for home. Missions to targets deep in Germany, like the infamous and costly raid on the Schweinfurt bull-bearing plants in August and October 1943, had to be flown largely unescorted, resulting in catastrophic losses. The Luftwaffe simply waited until the P-47 seconds turned back, then descended upon the bomber streams like a pack of wolves. The pilots' morale plummeted. They felt they had been handed a flawed tool for an impossible job. The laughter from the German side of the Channel could almost be heard in the silent briefing rooms. The narrative seemed set. The American industrial experiment had failed. The Jug, as it was now universally known, was a dud. But amidst the gloom, a few commanders, most notably Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, began to see the plane differently. Zemke was a brilliant tactician, a stern and demanding leader who forced his pilots to unlearn their Spitfire habits. He recognized that trying to fight the Germans on their terms in a low-altitude turning fight was suicide. The Thunderbolt's strengths lay elsewhere. He drilled his men relentlessly in new tactics built not on agility but on energy. The core principle was simple: altitude is life. He taught them to use the P-47's superb high-altitude performance and its phenomenal diving speed. The new doctrine was boom and zoom. Climb to 30,000 feet, where the turbo supercharger gave the P-47 a distinct advantage. From this perch, pick a target below, dive on it at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour, unleash a devastating burst from the 50 seconds, and then use the tremendous speed to climb back to the safety of high altitude before the enemy could react. Never turn, never get slow, fight a vertical war. Slowly, painstakingly, the tide began to shift. The pilots of the 56th, Zemke's Wolfpack, started to score victories. They learned to trust the plane's incredible ruggedness. They saw aircraft return to base with entire cylinders shot off the engine, with huge sections of the wing and tail missing. The big radial engine, unlike the liquid-cooled engines of the Spitfire and Bf-109, had no vulnerable coolant lines to be severed by a single lucky shot. It could absorb an astonishing amount of punishment and keep running. The sheer mass of the plane, once a source of ridicule, became a source of confidence. It was a stable gun platform, and it could outdive anything the Germans put in the air. Then came the incident that would become legend, the story that would forever silence the doubters and fundamentally alter the psychological landscape of the air war. On the 26th of June 1943, Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group was flying home from an escort mission. Over France, his squadron was ambushed by a swarm of few 190 from an elite German wing. Johnson's P-47 was singled out. A German ace closed to point-blank range and hammered his aircraft with a torrent of 20mm cannon shells and machine gun fire. Johnson's world exploded. The canopy shattered, spraying him with plexiglass. Cannon shells tore through the fuselage behind his head, igniting a fire. His hydraulic systems failed. Wounded and half-blinded, he fought to control the dying machine. The canopy was jammed shut, trapping him inside the burning cockpit. By all the laws of aerial combat, he should have been dead. The German pilot, Egon Meyer, a high-scoring ace, emptied his ammunition into the crippled Thunderbolt, certain it would disintegrate. But it didn't. The P-47 kept flying. Johnson, through sheer will, managed to put out the fire and limp his shredded aircraft back towards the English Channel. The German pilot, out of ammunition and in utter disbelief, pulled alongside, rocked his wings in a gesture of stunned salute, and turned for home. Johnson, flying a wreck that barely qualified as an aeroplane, made it back to his base in England. When the ground crew saw the plane, they were speechless. They stopped counting the bullet holes after 200. There were 21 cannon shell impacts alone. The story of Bob Johnson and his indestructible jug spread like wildfire. Among American pilots, it fostered a new, almost mythical belief in the plane's survivability. And within the Luftwaffe, the incident sent a shockwave of disbelief. German intelligence initially refused to accept the report. The laughter was gone, replaced by a grudging, fearful respect. The flying milk bottle had teeth. The winter of 1943 bled into the pivotal year of 1944. The air war over Europe was reaching its crescendo. The American 8th Air Force was now throwing formations of 1,000 bombers at the heart of Germany, and the Luftwaffe, though stretched thin, was fighting back with desperate ferocity. The P-47, now flown with a hard-won confidence, was a key player in this titanic struggle. But its fundamental limitation remained: range. While new drop tanks had extended its reach, it still couldn't accompany the bombers all the way to targets deep in eastern Germany, like Berlin. This problem was solved by the arrival of the P-51 Mustang in late 1943. With its laminar flow wing and Merlin engine, the Mustang had the legs to go all the way to Berlin and back. Many P-47 groups, including the vaunted 4th Fighter Group, began to transition to the new fighter in early 1944. For a moment, it seemed the Thunderbolt's time as a premier air superiority fighter was over. It would be relegated to a secondary role. But just as the Mustang began to take over the long-range escort mission, a simple but revolutionary technological upgrade gave the Thunderbolt a stunning second act. Engineers at Republic, addressing the persistent complaints about the P-47's climb rate, fitted the aircraft with a new Curtiss paddle blade propeller. The new propeller had wider, almost square-tipped blades that could bite into the air more effectively, dramatically improving thrust, particularly at lower altitudes. The effect was immediate and profound. The P-47's sluggish climb rate was transformed. It could now climb with, and in some cases even outclimb, its German adversaries. The change caught the Luftwaffe completely by surprise. Their pilots had been conditioned for over a year to a specific set of tactics against the Thunderbolt. They knew they could escape by pulling into a steep climb. Suddenly, in the spring of 1944, that tactic no longer worked. P-47 seconds were sticking to them in the climb, following them into the vertical, and then using their superior diving speed and firepower to finish the fight. German combat reports from this period are filled with confusion and frustration. Pilots who had once toyed with the jug were now being shot out of the sky. Francis Gaby Gabreski, a leading ace of the 56th Fighter Group, perfected a tactic of engaging German fighters and then pulling into a climbing spiral. The German pilot, expecting the P-47 to stall out, would follow, only to find the paddle-bladed Thunderbolt matching him turn for turn, climbing relentlessly until the German fighter lost energy and became a sitting duck. This technological jump, combined with the Thunderbolt's existing strengths, created the ultimate high-altitude energy fighter. Above 25,000 feet, where the turbo supercharger allowed the R-2800 engine to breathe freely, the P-47 was now untouchable. While the Merlin-powered Mustangs and the Daimler-Benz-powered Messerschmitts gasped for air, the Thunderbolt's power remained constant. It became the king of the stratosphere, the undisputed master of the high-altitude realm where the bomber streams flew. The 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, refused to switch to the P-51. They knew what they had. By the end of the war, they would remain the only group in the 8th Air Force still flying the P-47 by choice, and they would become the top-scoring fighter group in the command. But the Thunderbolt's transformation was not yet complete. As Allied armies prepared to land in Normandy, the strategic focus shifted. Air superiority was no longer just about protecting bombers. It was about dominating the entire battlefield, from 30,000 feet down to the treetops. And it was here, in the mud and the grime of the ground war, that the P-47 found its true calling and forged its most terrifying legacy. With its massive engine, heavy armor, and rugged construction, the Thunderbolt was perfectly suited for the brutal, low-level ground attack mission. Unlike the liquid-cooled P-51, which could be brought down by a single rifle bullet to its radiator, the P-47 could absorb an incredible amount of ground fire and keep flying. Pilots would return from missions with leaves and branches stuck in their engine cowlings, their fuselages peppered with small arms fire. They now carried a fearsome new arsenal. The P-47D models could haul up to 2,500 pounds of bombs, a payload half that of a B-17 heavy bomber, along with a devastating battery of 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, HVARs. Starting on D-Day and continuing through the breakout from Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, and the final push into Germany, the P-47 seconds of the 9th Air Force became the scourge of the German army. They roamed the skies over France and Germany in packs, hunting anything that moved. Their target was the sinew of the German war machine, its supply lines. They were no longer just fighters, they were jabos, the German slang for Jagdbomber or fighter bombers. The sound of an approaching Thunderbolt formation became a sound of pure terror for German ground troops. First came the deep, distinctive thunder of the R-2800 engines, a sound that carried for miles. Then came the dive, the plane growing from a speck to a screaming, 7-ton monster in seconds. And finally, the horrifying rip of the 850 caliber machine guns. The sound was so distinctive that German troops nicknamed it Roosevelt saw. For 30 seconds, a P-47 could pour a continuous stream of fire into a target, a wall of lead that could disintegrate trucks, shred supply depots, and tear apart troop concentrations. For the German soldier on the ground, there was no defense. To be caught in the open by a flight of Thunderbolts was a death sentence. The psychological impact was devastating. The constant threat from the sky induced a state of paralysis and panic that came to be known as Jabo fever. German commanders complained bitterly that they could not move troops or supplies during daylight hours. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, inspecting the Normandy front, noted in his diary that the Allied fighter bombers had complete mastery of the air and were hampering all movement. The statistics of this campaign of destruction are staggering. From D-Day to VE Day, Thunderbolt pilots claim to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. They systematically severed the arteries of the German army, starving the front lines of fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. The tactical brilliance of German generals on the ground was rendered irrelevant by the logistical chaos created by American industrial power in the air. The Juggernaut had found its purpose, not in the elegant duels of fighter aces, but in the grim, methodical work of grinding an army into dust. Years after the war, at a reunion of former adversaries, the German general of fighters, Adolf Galland, was asked about the P-47 Thunderbolt. He paused for a moment, the memory flickering in his eyes. "We made a terrible mistake," he said quietly. "We saw this big, heavy fighter, and we laughed. We thought, the Americans don't understand air combat. They built a bomber and called it a fighter. We were the ones who didn't understand." Galland's admission was the final, definitive epitaph for the Luftwaffe's early arrogance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the object of their initial scorn, had become a symbol of their ultimate defeat. It ended the war with an aerial kill-to-loss ratio of 4.6-1, having shot down 3,752 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. But its true legacy was written on the ground. It was the plane that broke the back of German logistics, the plane that instilled a Jabo fever in the hearts of battle-hardened soldiers. The Thunderbolt was never the most beautiful fighter. It was never the most agile. It was, in many ways, a perfect reflection of the nation that built it. Big, loud, pragmatic, and overwhelmingly powerful. It was a machine built not by artisans, but by assembly lines, a solution born not of tactical theory, but of industrial logic. Its chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, had set out to build a fighter that could survive. He succeeded beyond his wildest imagination, creating a plane that could absorb hundreds of bullet holes and still bring its pilot home. The young men who flew it, who had first cursed its weight and clumsiness, came to love it with a fierce devotion. They loved it for its raw power, for its 8 booming guns, and most of all, for its ability to take a beating and keep on flying. For them, the nickname Jug was no longer short for Juggernaut. It was a term of endearment for the ugly, stubborn, beautiful beast that had carried them through the fire and back. The story of the P-47 is a reminder that the nature of warfare is ever-changing. It is a story of how innovation can render established doctrines obsolete, how underestimation can be a fatal error. The laughter that greeted the Thunderbolt in the spring of 1943 was the sound of an old way of war, a way based on the ideal of the individual knight of the air. The thunderous roar of the P-47 seconds diving on a German armored column in the summer of 1944 was the sound of the future, a future defined by overwhelming firepower, industrial capacity, and the relentless application of mass. The flying milk bottle had become the thunderclap of victory.